And joining us now, we've got Michael Hardaway, former communications director for Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and Brendan Buck, MSNBC political analyst and former press secretary to House Speaker John Boehner. Michael, I want to go back to some of those recent ICE arrests. The mayor of Newark was detained for several hours for what they're calling trespassing at this new federal immigration detention center. There was also this arrest of a woman in Massachusetts where the agents pinned her teenage daughter to the ground during that, I don't know if we would call them arrests or whatever we're calling them, picking her up. How do most Americans feel about these incidents in the context of President Trump's immigration agenda?
This is a horror show. Now, remember, this is a man who promised during his campaign to deport 12 million people. And so I don't know if their plan to deport all of these people is to one by one rip them out of the arms of their parents and their children. I don't think that's going to work. What needs to actually happen is a comprehensive immigration bill similar to the bipartisan effort that Donald Trump killed last year. I think that would address this. I think these one-by-ones and arresting mayors, obviously, who have done nothing, and arresting others makes absolutely no sense. But it's really representative of Donald Trump's strategy, which is to operate this country the same way he did Trump steaks, and that didn't turn out well.
And Brendan, beyond that, I'm wondering what you make of Trump advisor Stephen Miller saying they're looking at suspending habeas corpus, which would deny any due process for migrants. You know, you're seeing some pushback on that, even from some very unlikely places, Joe Rogan among them. Could the president be losing support on the immigration front if people believe he's overreaching here?
Yeah.
New reaction from the official who appears to be the first target of the first criminal investigation by President Trump into his political adversaries. New York Attorney General Letitia James telling MSNBC that the federal probe into allegation of housing fraud is, quote, baseless and discredited. In February last year, Trump was ordered to pay more than $450 million in penalties from a lawsuit brought by James's office that accused him of inflating his net worth to secure financial benefits.
This is nothing more than an extension of his revenge, his retribution, and he finally got up to the J's. And so I stand prepared to respond to these baseless attacks with facts. And we look forward, obviously, to further discussions with the Department of Justice. I have been someone who has been targeted, but I am not fearful. I am fearless. And I will continue to walk into the office of the New York State Attorney General and, again, protect the residents and protect them from any harms coming from the federal government.
Back again, we've got Michael Hardaway and Brendan Buck. Michael, you heard those fighting words there from James, but in announcing this investigation into whether or not she falsified paperwork for property she owns in Virginia and New York, the U.S. attorney said James, quote, unethically ran around the state campaigning on getting Donald Trump. The merits of what James is being accused of aside for the moment, what is your takeaway when prosecutors are explicitly saying there is a political component to the investigation into her?
Well, it's shocking. She's being attacked and persecuted for doing her job, which is prosecuting someone who committed a crime like Donald Trump did. I mean, this doesn't happen in a real democracy. The idea that Donald Trump has weaponized the entire federal government against all of his enemies and opponents, from the law firms that represented his political opponents to the federal officials that have prosecuted him for his spreadsheet of crimes that he's committed. I mean, this is shocking, and we're only 5 months in. My real question is, where does this go? I mean, we've got 3.5 years of this guy who seems to have no regard for the Constitution or the rule of law. How far does this go?
But Brendan, Trump campaigned on the promise of that retribution against his perceived enemies. So should anyone be surprised? And what is your take on this investigation?
I mean, he did, but he also said that he wasn't going to use DOJ in the way that he says it was used against him. And obviously we can't take that very seriously. He's already put out executive memorandums, EOs by the president saying going after people like Miles Taylor and Chris Krebs. He's very out in the open going after people he perceived to be going after him previously. Certainly this feels like retribution. It feels pretty small, sort of ticky-tacky stuff that they're going after her on. But also feels a bit like intimidation to people who may be interested in coming after him in the future. We know that he's gone after law firms, trying to discourage any law firms from taking any cases that may hurt him. So they're covering all their bases just to make sure that nobody's holding Donald Trump accountable in any way that they can.
Ellie, you told me earlier when I asked you about Stephen Miller's comments, you thought his description there was wrong. Why?
Dead wrong, crazy, dangerous. Let's start with the Constitution itself. What Stephen Miller says essentially is the Constitution gives us the right to do this, to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which, by the way, just means the ability to go to court to challenge a detention. He's saying the Constitution tells us we can suspend that. But if you look at the actual Constitution, Article 1 is a restriction. It says we should not withdraw the writ of habeas corpus unless there is a rebellion or an invasion and the public safety is threatened. The Constitution sets the bar incredibly high there, and the history bears that out, which you mentioned before. It's been invoked 4 times, right? Civil War, okay, I think we can understand that, and as Maggie said, it was controversial. Then during Reconstruction, in a very narrow way, by the way, only in certain counties in South Carolina, to try to counteract the Ku Klux Klan. In 1905, in the Philippines, when we had a hand in governing the Philippines, there was a real rebellion happening in certain regions. And then, what was the fourth?
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, right. And
that was the last time it was used, was 1941.
Exactly, 1944, and only, again, in certain areas of Hawaii. So it's been used very carefully in real invasions, narrowly geographically.
So I think the question is if they're privately looking at this, and it's notable that the president referenced it a few weeks ago, and Stephen Miller basically confirmed it today. I mean, it at least speaks to the seriousness with which they are looking at it.
Yeah, I think it's chilling, frankly, that the president is discussing this behind the scenes. I mean, that is an incredibly dangerous line to cross. Habeas corpus is, and this is the reason I think there's some Republican pushback to this, it is one of the most fundamental rights and protections that we have in this country. The right to go into court and say, I am being wrongfully locked up behind bars. If we are going to pull that right, that is a big deal. That's a red line.
Let's bring in Democratic Representative from Nevada, Stephen Horsford. He sits on the House Ways and Means Committee. He's also Chairman Emeritus of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congressman, I want to start with what we were just talking about, this arrest of Newark's Mayor Ras Baraka. He was taken into custody, the administration is saying, for attempting to enter an ICE detention center. What is your reaction, and what message does this arrest send to other lawmakers?
Well, thank you, Christina, for having me on. And look, 2 things are true about the detainment of Mayor Baraka. And one is that the Trump administration continues to implement policies that are chaotic. And number 2, elected officials, on behalf of the constituents they represent, have every right to hold this administration accountable. Mayor Baraka was there with several members of the Congressional Black Caucus who represent that area. They were there doing their duty on behalf of their constituents, providing oversight. And the fact that the mayor was joining them, he represents that city and had already raised major concerns about the lack of building permits over this for-profit detention facility. And so I think that there needs to be more accountability of this administration, and elected officials in Congress or the local officials, in this case, Mayor Baraka, have every right to act on behalf of their constituents.
And this is not the only place we're seeing this. There are several closed or defunct former prisons around the country that the administration is trying to reopen to turn into detention facilities. But a lot of them, as the mayor was alleging, don't have the correct permitting, haven't gotten the permission of the local governments. Could these local governments provide a backstop to some of these administration policies?
Well, I know that Donald Trump and his administration don't believe it, but we are under a rule of law. They may have authoritarian tactics, but there are roles to play at the local and state level when it comes to the operation of any facilities, detention or otherwise. I have a local facility like this in the rural part of my district. I have conducted oversight tours of that facility in the past, and I plan to do it again. And I would commend to this administration that I have every right to do that, as do my colleagues who joined with Mayor Baraka the other day, because it's our constitutional duty under the Article 1 Constitution and as members of Congress.
I also want to ask you about this effort House Democrats are making, kind of It's kind of a long shot effort on the Hill to try to stop these drastic cuts to Medicaid and SNAP benefits as part of this GOP mega bill. All right, we're going to dig into some parliamentary procedure here, so stick with me. Maybe you can help explain it. But they've put forward a discharge petition, which, with enough signatures, would force a floor vote on the bill and prevent the House from making cuts to these key services. Can you tell us more about this Democratic strategy here, and do you think it's going to work?
Well, Leader Jeffries and House Democrats are working every angle possible to prevent some of the most devastating cuts that congressional Republicans and Donald Trump are trying to enact on the American people. Republicans have said that they don't want to cut Medicaid or take away nutrition programs for children and seniors. This is their opportunity to join with Democrats to tell their leadership, no cuts. Hands off our Medicaid, hands off nutrition assistance, hands off veterans.
Trump is creating conflict in his homes. New York, where he's from, Trump Tower. New Jersey, where he owns one of his golf clubs, where he lives in the summer. You know, Trump, during, at least when he wasn't president, would spend the winters down in Florida and would spend his summers in New Jersey. Really, it was his second home. And there you have him attacking New Jersey politicians. And in New York, you have him sicking his DOJ on Letitia James, right? For having the audacity to actually go after him. Now, the difference is James did it by the book, had tons of evidence, took her time. It was, if anything, she probably said, is there any way I cannot do this? Not because she wanted to be corrupt for Trump, but it's like, she knew the political firewall that was coming, and she knew that in a democratic society, you want to avoid taking on political opponents in the court if avoidable. But she realized that there was so much criminality, at least allegedly by Trump and his company. She convicted his company in criminal court, and he was convicted in civil court and all of that. She had to. And so you could see Trump picking these fights. But why this matters is that Donald's whole presidency, it's been proven, there was no actual policy here. None. No real policy. Because his whole thing was, I'm going to do tariffs, but they're going to be great. And they failed. But what's the other thing he promised people? What's the other thing he promised people? Yeah, I'm going to be cruel to people at the border, but I will be your retribution. And then he tried to, at the last days of the campaign, and frankly, guys, I'm going to be honest, a lot of dumb Americans believed him. And they said, what I mean by revenge and retribution is I'm going to do such a great job, people will be forced to acknowledge it. That's what he said. But what we all knew he meant was what he's doing, arresting people, arresting Democratic politicians, sicking the police on universities, and yes, investigating the people that investigated him. It's a massive fight in Trump's home place.